Welcome to the Art of Being Nimble podcast. I'm Glenn Smith and I'm your host. In this series, we'll introduce you to business leaders from around the world who will interview about how they've overcome challenges of operating a business in today's dynamic world. Through their stories, we're going to hear about what problems they've had and how they fixed them and the benefits it's brought them. Importantly, you're going to learn some lessons about what you can then use in your organisation to do similar things. So let's get on with the show and hear the next story. My guest today is James Savage, a chartered director and experienced non-executive director who's worked with dozens of tech companies across the UK and Asia. He spent years sitting around board tables, often at the point where businesses are growing fast and the pressure is on. In this conversation, we talk about what a non-executive director truly is and what they're not. We explore how NEDs can support founders and leadership teams, why experience matters when things get messy, and how the best NEDs bring calm, challenge, and perspective when it's needed most. So, James, good afternoon. Welcome to the Art of Being Nimble. Thank you for joining us. We're going to talk today about non-exec directors. Maybe let's start off with the very basic question. What is a non-exec director?
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks, Glenn, for inviting me. What's a non-exec director? And I think, being honest, a lot of people don't really know, and a lot of people use a wrong definition. So it's good for us, a good place to start. So the way I always actually prefer to name myself as an independent director rather than a non-executive director. Non-executive director, NED, is a sort of standard terminology that's sort of used in the UK. But in other places of the world, it can be known as an independent director. And the reason is that, you're not fulfilling an executive function. You're not an employee of the company. You're part-time. And, you don't actually have any management role. And your role is entirely at the board level, dealing with board issues. So it's to do with the things that the board deal with. Now, non-executive basically means you're not employed, but you do fulfill a role in the company. And usually, that can be anything from sort of, turning up to a quarterly meeting for 4 or 5 hours to someone who spends a day a week, say, but not a sort of full-time employee. But it's all about the governance of the company rather than the operation of the company. And that's kind of a fundamental point.
Okay, and so I guess being not an employee means that independence allows you to ask all the tough questions.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that I think about, and sort of to explain the role a little bit more, not just sort of the definition of it, is, and the way I like to sort of work is very much as sort of a counsellor, and be someone who's an advisor for the team, and really acting as a bit of a problem solver. So, okay, we've all been scratching our head about this for a month. We don't really know what the answer is. Let's bring the NEDs in who've come in from different angles, different viewpoints, maybe, hopefully some more experience too. You're hiring people with more experience, and they will bring a different view to it. And that's sort of a very powerful thing to sort of bring into it, is sort of those external views, and that's what we bring. And then the other thing is, the role in corporate governance is that, also a challenge, right? And the fact that, CEOs and founders and people are great, but sometimes, as a director, as sort of separate to an executive, your job is to look after the shareholders, not necessarily to work for the CEO. The independent bit, again, you don't work for the CEO, you work for the board and the shareholders, and your job is to try and promote the position of the shareholders, and that may not align with the CEO and the management. And so, you therefore got to produce that challenge. This thing you're proposing to me doesn't seem to be good for the shareholders. Are we sure we're doing the right thing for the shareholders? And that is a position that you as a director, you have to take. I think one of the things that I would say is that a common misconception, and one of those things that happens a lot with people who take the step up from an executive, say being a manager or a division manager or whatever, and step up into being a full board member and fail to realize the distinction And the big distinction is if any director has to represent the shareholders and not necessarily their line manager above them, right? So you have to take an independent view. You may have been given an order by your superior and you sit on the board, but if you're on the board and it's clear to you that the shareholders' interests are not being served, you need to reject your thing. So that's one of the things that a lot of people don't do when they join boards, is they act as an executive following, their management criteria, rather than acting in the best interest of the shareholder and looking in as an outsider and saying, right, are we doing the right thing for the shareholder? And a lot of directors don't make that step. Now, the risk in that is actually, as a director, if you don't do the right things for the shareholders, you do what your line manager tells you, then you are liable, and that's quite a big problem. So you do need to learn fairly early on that what your exact role is and your liability as a director. And if I would encourage people who are about to make that step in their career, go and talk to some of your compliance people or your lawyers or whatever and get some advice and make sure you understand where you are, because you can very quickly find yourself in trouble. And I must admit, in my career, I did this in my sort of early 30s, and I was taken aside by my chief compliance officer and told, okay, this is it. And if it comes to something where you need to decide between us and the shareholders, either you need to resign or you need to back the shareholders, right? That's your position. So be aware of that. It's not just another job title being a director. Your legal position changes, and you need to be aware of that.
Well, it was great that you were given that advice back then. But yes, so that's interesting. So that accountability. So you're there on behalf of the shareholders, but maybe it's worth exploring a little bit the accountability and who can come knocking on your door or on a NED's door if they don't like the decision, other than the shareholders.
Well, the accountability is to the shareholders as overall.
Mm-hmm.
So, except in sort of extreme circumstances, you are responsible to the shareholders overall, and you get elected by the shareholders, right? That's what happens. So, if you don't do your job, there are methods within the governance of most companies where the chairman and the board can push out people who I think are not a good fit, and propose new people for the shareholders, and then the shareholders vote on that, right? And that's kind of the way that you get appointed. I myself sort of specialized in sort of scaling tech companies, which generally are private, generally have a controlling shareholder. So obviously they have a great deal of say in who gets appointed to the board. Although, as I said earlier, as someone who gets appointed as an independent director, I see a key role in that is supporting the minority investors and making sure that the company is being run for the advantage of all the shareholders and not necessarily the controlling shareholder, because that's your legal duty.
And so it sounds like there's quite a lot of balance that needs to be done, because I can imagine if you're there on behalf of the shareholders, you may be rubbing up against the team that are running the business who may disagree with what the shareholders want. But then you've also talked about if you're representing the different types of shareholders who've got different investments in that, or different size of investments, how you can balance and trade off those different opinions. It must be quite a delicate position to have to navigate.
Yes, certainly it is. And, I think as someone who spent, quite a bit of my career doing venture capital, the way you put the shareholder lists together and you align interest is fundamental. And if, when you're doing those deals, you don't have clear communication and you don't align targets between all the different groups, then you can indeed have significant discord at the board. And I've been through a number of occasions where that has happened, and it all gets quite complicated, I think is the answer. But usually there's a way forward, and the majority of the directors form a view, and things can be worked through. Not necessarily always to everybody's agreement, but if you've got sensible people around the table who've been around a while and understand some of these things, then you can reach a sensible conclusion. But absolutely, yes, you have to resolve those things, and that's one of the key things that you need to deal with as a director is those kind of sort of conflicts and understanding how that works within the shareholders. Yeah.
You mentioned just now about one of the benefits that a NED can bring or independent director can bring is when if the company's stuck and wants another pair of eyes, fresh pair of eyes coming in. I suppose that's an interesting perspective, because I know you've said before that founders often don't know what they don't know. And so maybe if you've got any examples that you could share of, how you've come in and, of how the team of NEDs has helped the founder or the management team get past the stuck point.
I think it's a very valid point. I mean, I spent a lot of my career growing technology companies in Asia, and I was in the whole sort of tech ecosystem as it kicked off in Asia in the late 90s and left there in the late teens. And in which time, basically, we'd grown from, a dozen companies and two venture capital firms into the second largest tech venture scheme in the world. I mean, China is now absolutely monumental in this industry. It's not as big as Silicon Valley, but it's nearly there. And so I've seen that scale, right? And I work mainly in sort of the southwest of England and those areas. And while we have a great ecosystem and a lot of great companies coming up, we're at the stage in the ecosystem where we don't have a great deal of depth in the management teams. Now, let me sort of put some, criteria around that. So, for instance, if I was investing as a venture capital company or I was running a Series A company in the States, the founder, would probably have done it a couple of times already, would have put several million of his own money into the company to start it. And he would have a team of four or five people around him who'd done it at least once before and gone from a startup to an exit. And then the level of people beneath that would probably not have experience, right? But that then means that team of sort of half a dozen people have done this a number of times, right? So they know all the steps along the way. They know all the pitfalls. But we're not at that stage in the Southwest. Almost all, I think there's very few companies where we have a founder who's done it two or three times before or even once before. So these teams are all trying to do it for the first time. And, founders are great. Founders are very bold. That's what you want. You want sort of people who believe in themselves and, are very convinced about the mission of the company. But they've never done the journey before. So what they need along for the ride, in my opinion, and where I come in, is people who've been on the ride before and know exactly, as various things come around the corner, how to deal with them. But also that heads up of, okay, in 6 months' time, you're doing this decision now, but we will need to be, here, say, with this particular thing. And if you take the decision now, we're not going to be there, right? We need to do something else about this. It's just those things around the corner that you don't see coming. So, let's try and give you a sort of couple of examples. Fairly typical one, company has a plan, trying to scale, everything's going according to plan. One large customer, who's probably 30-40% of revenue, everything's going great guns. And then, some politician does something wrong and you get a global economic collapse, right? Whatever it was, whether it was 2000, 2003, 2008, whatever. And big customer turns around and says, yeah, I don't want to do that anymore. And you sort of look at it and think, well, I was going to raise money in 2 years, in a year's time. But actually where we are now, and the founder saying, well, hang on, I've lost that customer. I need to go and find a new customer. Well, yeah, you do. But actually what you need to do is actually the whole rug's been pulled from underneath you because of what happened to the economy. We need to rebuild the budget and work out we need to be around with money in 2 years' time, and we won't be able to raise any more money for 2 years, right? So let's rework the plan, bring down the amount of growth, bring down the amount of spend, and make sure we're still here in 2 years' time. Because one of the things that I've learned is actually the people who are standing when the race starts again at the end of the 2 year cycle are the people who really, really do well. But you need to make that call very early on that things have moved, right? And a lot of founders who are, in their mid-20s or up to 30 years old have maybe not really seen a big crash before. and I've seen quite a few during my career. So knowing how to behave as you go into those to make sure that you're going to make it out at the end is a set of sort of expertise that comes from sort of experience, basically, and knowing how that works.
You mentioned just now that in the southwest of the UK that there's a lot of the founders don't have that battle scar 2 or 3 times in experience. Is that a regional challenge of the UK or the UK generally when you compare to the US?
So the way I would think about it, clearly the US is the most sophisticated. They have the most sophisticated capital markets in this space. I would put sort of China as number 2. And, this is all my own personal opinion. I would say Europe is a sort of kind of distant third at the moment, of which London is probably the leading area. India's coming up on the rails pretty quickly, and I think they stand a good chance of getting past us Europeans. But London's pretty good. It's not there yet, I think, is the answer. I would say it's probably 4 or 5 years ahead of where we are in the southwest, which is why quite often we have to go up there to get our expertise for one thing or another, because they are more expert at it than us. But they still are a good way behind where sort of the other sort of big global leaders are, I would say, in what's going on. And it's all a matter of, same way as it takes 10 years, to train a lawyer in a legal firm or an accountant in an accounts firm. It takes 10 years to train a good venture capital partner. It takes 10 years to train, for a good entrepreneur, a good entrepreneurial team to go once through the loop and go back and start again.
Of
right?
course.
And it's not something you can fix tomorrow. It's experiences. So you've got to keep priming the pump and pushing things through, and it will happen. It will happen.
So just before we move on to, I know the area that you're sort of specialize in, which is that growth and scale parts of an organization. One last question about just the role in itself. What, if you were speaking to someone, so I know you do a lot of stuff with Institute of Directors, and someone came up to you and said, "Oh, James, I want to be a NED." What criteria or qualities would you look for to think, well, what's going to make a good one?
So what would make a good NED? I've had the sort of pleasure and experience of when I came back to the UK, I actually went through the whole of the IOD's training. So I'm now a chartered director. And that basically breaks down into sort of 3 pieces. And one of them is technical knowledge. And it's a technical knowledge of the law of being a director, the technical knowledge of how to manage a strategy and a mission and that sort of governance level of a company, not the operational side of it. Understanding finances if you've not dealt with that before, because you're going to be fed a lot of financial information and you need to be able to analyze it if you're a director. Also, the responsibilities you have as a director, so the detailed knowledge. So you're going to need some grounding in that. Then you sort of need to build up some practical experience about using that knowledge, which is the next sort of stage in the qualification. And finally, you need to go away and prove that you've actually done it. And, you've actually sort of been through a few scrapes and you've sat there when a company's about to have significant cash flow issues and you've made the right decisions about what to do, or you've lost the CEO unexpectedly and you've suddenly got to work out, or you've had some disaster and your factory's burnt down. How do you deal with that stuff? Yeah, you need to be prepared sort of for the unexpected. And one of the more sort of dramatic ones in my career was we had a company we were invested in that was doing very well, growing very quickly, very close-knit executive team of the CEO and the CFO who were working very well together. And the CFO drowned one day, completely out of the blue, had no idea what happened. They'd been lifetime friends. So the CEO obviously had his own share of challenges to deal with this. But the rest of the team weren't really capable of running the company. So all of us directors had to jump in and sort of arrived 2 days later and sort of, right, how do we deal with this, right? So some of it is sort of dealing with the unexpected. And that's a very extreme case. But, a lot of things happen unexpectedly in quick, fast scaling tech companies. And, it's a matter of being able to jump in there at the emergency and in some cases hold the CEO's hand because he doesn't quite know how to deal with it. And hopefully you've seen a few things like this before. And sometimes you just need to sort of, maybe the chairman needs to step up and really make some big decisions, right? And that happens.
Well, yeah, and that was sounded quite an extreme case, but it was great that in that instance the company had a group of people who could rally around the problem and make a difference.
And actually, the company did very well afterwards. The CEO took a few months off, came back, and the company did. We lost 4 to 6 months, but that's not unusual in a tech startup, so that was kind of okay. But yeah, had there not been some other people around, I feel that it would have been a bit more tragic than that. So there you go.
Made best of a bad situation by the sound of it. But,
exactly.
So let's move on to the scaling then. So you've had lots of experience as a NED in that rapid growth scaling environment. Not so much how does the role change, but maybe you could just talk to us about that sort of environment and some of the challenges that you need to help the organization with.
Yeah, no, and I think this is a material part of it. So, at the stage when I join companies, usually they're sort of small teams who've been very dynamic. And everybody's been doing whatever job came through the door and running around. And at an early stage of a company, that's absolutely what you need to do, right? And, the kind of people who do that, on very entrepreneurial, very sort of positive people, and that's great. But as you then scale a company, and that brings its own issues. But what happens is obviously it grows, and one of the things that I've found that I've needed to sort of coach CEOs through is a lot of them have been very detailed people and not that experienced in managing big teams of people, and it's learning to sort of trust in your hires and let them get on with the job roles you've set them, and step back and step up to that level of being a CEO where you're one or two things are issues you deal with, but generally overseeing things and making sure that the ship is heading in the right direction rather than being managed in the detail. And hiring is fundamentally important to that. Make sure you hire the right people, and understanding what you need when, and also that transition, because some managers find it very difficult to go through that transition from being on top of the detail to stepping up and moving more into that sort of governance field where you're setting a budget and a set of targets and expecting a team to deliver them and monitoring them against those things, rather than, okay, well, that contract's fallen through, how do I fix it? You need to step back and say, well, he's in charge of that, he's got to fix it. And coaching that team to make that separation, that's a fundamental one. And they often, people really struggle with that. I think the second one is, is those job roles, controls, processes. Everything's very dynamic when your company's young and nothing really gets recorded that well. And it's kind of okay because everybody knows what's happening, right? But very quickly that will fall apart unless you can, impose good controls, good systems, and sort of the stuff that goes with being, a larger corporate. And some entrepreneurs find that very stifling. But I'm afraid if you're going to scale at the rate that these companies need to scale, you need to adjust to that, and it's part of that coaching. I think the other thing that sort of is sort of kind of fundamental is if you're a NED in that kind of situation, is that it's very lonely being a CEO if you're the founder, and you've got a lot of people, high performing people beneath you who are probably doing absolutely astounding work, right? And it's great, but quite often things are not going quite so great, and maybe you can't communicate that to everybody because you're the CEO and you've got the corporate message to relay. But maybe on a Tuesday night you really do think the CFO's fluffed something up and he's gone completely off the rails, but you're not quite sure. So 5 o'clock at night you phone the NED and say, look, this has happened today. I don't think that's right, but I'm not sure. What do you think, right? And having someone on the end of the phone who is got the best interest of the company at heart, has been there before, to have those phone calls once every week or two when you come across a problem where you think, yeah, I don't know about this. I don't know, or I'm not sure I know the answer.
If we think about, so the organizations are scaling, I'm just interested in reflecting on also about how you thought how the role of a NED or independent director is evolving with the use with technology. Obviously, AI is on the lips of everybody these days because it's the buzzword of the moment. But are you seeing or predicting an evolution of the role as technology is changing and adapting for organizations?
Okay, I think there's a couple of different parts to this, maybe three different parts to this. First one is I think AI will be a tool, and the kind of position that NED takes and their role in the organization is all about sort of experience, know-how, communication, while writing a report will be made a lot easier by an AI, but that's almost true of everybody. I think there'll be productivity gains for NEDs, but I don't think the role will change in itself. I don't see it as a threat to technology. I see it as a set of tools, but maybe technology will change faster and faster. And in which case then obviously you need to do that. I think NEDs who have an understanding of the technology and where it's going are quite a powerful asset to companies these days, because you do need to understand, what ways this might hit your particular business and how you're going to deal with it. And hiring a NED who might be aware of that is a very powerful thing. I think one of the things that sort of I would say as a NED is it's generally fairly underappreciated. And people don't really appreciate the value. And I think being fair to the average person, that's because a lot of NEDs are not really that good. And a lot of people are, well, I need to put someone on the board, I'll put my brother on, right, or whatever it is. And the question is then, what value are they adding, right? And do they really understand what's involved in being a director? So I feel, the future is that actually it becomes more professionalized. I think we're still. I mean, I've been through a number of different corporate governance legal changes during the course of my career, through all sorts of different steps. I still don't think we had it right. I still don't think we have a strong enough voice inside corporations for the shareholders. And I see directors and particularly non-executive directors playing an increasing role in that form of governance. I see professionalizing them to represent shareholders. I think the tug has always been the executives being in charge, and now certainly in public companies will trust the fund managers to police them. Well, I don't think we're finding that that's working that well. We've had a number of different runs at it. My belief is that there is definitely a stronger role for a professionalized non-executive director. So then, training, qualification, continuing professional education, and enabling people then to build trust in those people and the experience that they bring to the role will then then add value to what's going on. And that's what, and I think if you look at the IOD, that's one of the things that they're clearly on a mission to do. And I think it's sort of changing people's mindset. As a, what can we say, as a sort of a white male of a certain age, I think that and people who are younger and more diverse than me look at non-executive directors and quite rightfully say it's a job for the old boys. And I think probably too often that is the case. And we need to professionalize it. And I think everybody sees now the value in diversity of opinion around a board table. And that's one of the great things that a board brings, is that diversity of view. So if you have got a load of sort of old boys around the table, you're really not making value. So I'd say that was the other area we're going to, is just trying to get as many and as diverse a set of people as you can around the table who've got the right experience and the right understanding of what's required. And then I think tremendous value is there to be released. But how we get there, I don't know. I think myself and the IOD we're still thinking about it.
Yeah, I could imagine that, as we talked earlier, that one of the benefits of an ed is having that experience, and experience unfortunately comes with time, and that's a hard thing to short circuit, isn't it? So that as the diversity of the leaders of today is increasing, maybe not, well, not maybe not enough, not enough, maybe not quick enough, but that will filter through. But I was thinking about when the professionalism is this. Do you think there is a call for the shareholders to be setting a higher standard when they're looking for an ed? Because because if they are looking for someone who, like yourself, is maybe not necessarily chartered, but is has got a dedication to professional development and got that experience, then they can be setting that standard and improving and raising the bar.
Yes, and it is about, I think, us people who are more qualified, going out there and proving the value in what we deliver, right? And just and trying to encourage more young people to come up underneath us and do it. And while I say experience, I mean, one of the things that I think has been considered and tried, and I think is from people I've spoken to who've tried it, is having sort of senior executives sort of coached by people in their 20s about how people in their 20s think about things, is a tremendously valuable thing to do. And because while they may not have spent a whole career in corporate life understanding the ins and outs of what goes on and the diversity of what goes on in the business away from their particular line of business, they do understand the thought process of people their own age and their priorities. And, opening your eyes to that as a senior manager or a director is a very powerful thing to do. Again, it's that diversity. While they may not have 30 years worth of corporate experience, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be listening pretty hard to what those people have to say.
Well, no, and it reminds me of one of the other episodes where I was talking to someone and we were talking about the generational challenges of leading organizations. And if you've got senior leaders who, without being stereotypical, are maybe, middle to late aged white men often, to then say to someone in their 20s, they're 2 generations away. And that's quite a big delta between the mindset of those senior leaders and someone of their age.
So yeah, there's a lot of value in it. So I think there's definitely a much stronger role, and we NEDs need to play our role in that. I think chairman of boards who are selecting candidates need to do that. Everybody who owns a share needs to think about the value, what value they might get out of it.
So if we sort of start to sort of reflect on this, then now, James. If you were talking to shareholders or founders who are in that growth phase and were looking to maybe they've put the warm body that was their uncle in the NED, or they think, well, I've got some NEDs, but I don't really see what they're doing for me. What advice would you give them when you're saying, well, what to look for, who to look for to help them create a successful business?
I think one of the most frequent mistakes I see from anybody hiring NEDs is they look through the weaknesses in their management team and they identify a hole, but it's not quite a whole person. So be that sales, marketing, technical, whatever it is. So, well, I can't really afford a whole-time expert on that. I'll hire a NED who is a good salesman, right? And I'll pay him for a day a week, raid his Rolodex. He'll do a great job as being my sales director. But the problem with that is that's functional hiring. He should be a part-time sales director, sales, head of sales, right? He's not a director and a NED. We've just spent an hour discussing about what that is and the value that it adds. And I think the problem is that a lot of the founders and the management teams don't understand the value that sort of NED role that we've talked about during the last hour, what it is, and they hire people who are just another functional manager, and that's not the right thing to do. There's a lot more to being, going through the growth process, strategy, experience of scaling. I mean, I think that's the other thing, is that they hire a sales director and they're going through a scaling process. If I'm talking to a scaling company, and the challenge is not necessarily, you can hire on a functional level good marketing people, good technical people, but actually finding people who've scaled businesses before is really, really hard because there aren't that many. So maybe that is someone that, you should have on the end of the phone that you can call every week to say, okay, here's a new problem. What could we do about it? And let the functional guys do the functional things. So yeah, that's something that sort of frustrates me because I just feel that people are not making the best value of the experience that's out there.
And also in the modern day, fractional roles are now a much more common thing to hire and find people serving. So actually, you can scratch that itch much easier. I just was thinking before we close out. I've used the saying before that organizations need a leader for every season, and depending on where the business is, it might need a different leader for a different season of its life. Are NEDs like that as well? Do you need to have a different group of NEDs for different phases of an organization's growth and development? Would you expect them to be evolving?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I would not be the right person to get to get a NED off the ground and sort of help you through your engineering development and stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't really know that well. And equally, once you're through your IPO and you're into dealing with public shareholders, that's not my area of expertise. I would almost certainly resign at that point.
Right. Okay.
If my term wasn't up, because I can't help really. It's not my area of expertise. So to my mind, it is kind of stage dependent, definitely. And to be honest, it is about having that outside point of view all the time. And that's, to me, where the real value is. It's the outside point of view. And if you've been around the table for 3 years, you're no longer an outsider. So your value dissipates. So even if the company's still at the same stage, 3 to 5 years, you should think of moving on because you're no longer the outsider who can add real value. Hopefully what you have, the value you have is already embedded in the business. It's time to go and do it for somebody else.
Brilliant. Okay, fabulous. Well, thank you, James. It's been a very insightful conversation. I've learned lots as well, and hopefully the listeners have enjoyed it as well. Much appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know I've had fun making it. I'd be thrilled to hear your feedback or suggestions for topics you'd like me to explore. Email the show at podcast@nimbility.co. You can also check out all the other episodes in the series at nimbility.co/podcast. If you've enjoyed the content, it would mean a lot to us if you could subscribe and rate the show in your podcast app. Your support helps others discover the show and allows us to keep spreading the word. So until next time, thanks for listening.